Hey everyone, and welcome to the first official session inside of the Digital Academy, courtesy the Digital Compass. My name is Kyle Stephen, and I will be working with you throughout the entire process for this course as we develop the character concept illustration for OOF inside of Adobe Photoshop. So just want to say thanks for joining me here today, and let's prepare to hop right in. First things first, I just want to one of the first things I want to mention is that in order to successfully complete this follow along this walkthrough, you will need a graphic tablet, or if you are proficient with the mouse, then as we say, go strong. But outside of that, you can use any form of a graphic tablet that you have that can connect to your computer, or if you have a touchscreen portable tablet that has a stylus, that can work also. So once you have your device ready, connected, let's start Photoshop. Now when Photoshop opens, one of the first things that you will notice is that there's a home screen that shows you all of the projects that you would have worked on most recently. Now this is pretty convenient because it actually shows you the various file types, different versions that you may have for a file, gives you a date, and allows you to access those files or put them in folders, group them appropriately. Once you're ready to create your project, you simply click the New File button, and once the menu pops up, you'd notice that there are some presets that are provided that you can use to start working. The standard size that we would typically work with is 1920 by 1080, 300 dpi, and this allows us to get that full HD resolution and work small enough where we can post across social media without truly maxing out our memory. So as long as we're ready to work with those settings with that resolution, we just make sure all of our settings on the right hand side is set to 1920 by 1080. We are working in landscape mode, and 16-bit is definitely the way to go for the true quality color in your work. You're going to make sure that the background in this case is set to white. We don't want a transparent background because we just want a white background as our foundation. And then, once we are satisfied with all of the settings here, we hit create. Now, the interface at first can look pretty intimidating and robust. I can promise that at the end of this session that you would become familiar enough with the interface, with all of the tools, the buttons, and just what they do and how you can use it to create your characters, your environments, your concepts, your sketches, your designs, your layout. Because Photoshop is such a powerful tool. It's a multidisciplinary kind of tool where persons across different disciplines would ultimately use Photoshop to create a lot of their visual ideas, whether that be creating it from scratch or simply using it to do some measure of compositing or post-processing, drafting of ideas, the bashing of images. So you can do photo editing, photo manipulation, and you can do digital painting, you can do the digital sketching. So there's so many different tools that you can use inside of the software that it would be remiss of me to not explain at least some of them as we go along, even if we don't use all of the tools. Okay, so a couple things. What we can see now is that on the bottom left hand side of the screen, you see those two boxes, that black and white box, those boxes there. That's actually the color swatches, your color pickers. And if you select it, what should happen is a menu will pop up allowing you to select the colors that you would want to use in those two swatches, because you can alternate between those two colors using the keyboard shortcut X. You can use the X key on your keyboard as a shortcut to alternate between any two colors that you might assign to those background and foreground colors in that swatch selection at the bottom left hand side. But we're going to go with more of a kind of salmon flesh tone just to get our drawing started. And once you've selected it with the eye picker tool, with the color picker tool, then we hit OK. the brush is ready to use that particular color of paint. Before we move on to actually drawing, however, we would need to ensure a couple of things are in place, like setting up our brushes, or in this case, the one brush that I will be using to do the line art. Using brushes, we tend to, young artists or persons that might be new to digital art could get caught up in the fancifulness of using different types of brushes or just the technical aspect of it. But as with traditional art in real life, if you are not able to get a grasp of any given tool, chances are you're going to be searching for the tool that somehow satisfies all of your questions and answers all of your design prayers by just using one brush and it does it all. But in this particular instance, we are going to use one brush to get our baselines down, and that would be using a standard round brush, and then making sure that in our brush settings we have our pen pressure, we have the brush settings where we could get the brush type as well as the transfer set to pen pressure, and this allows us to ultimately simulate what drawing on real paper in real life might be like. So once the tablet is connected, you turn those settings on. You have the brush tool selected by either selecting it from the panel on the left hand side or pressing the B key on your keyboard. You then are able to start sketching using those settings, using the color that we've selected, and start producing the rough organic lines as the foundation for your character. In some of my previous videos, I would have mentioned using organic lines to produce character designs to help develop the form, the shape, just the overall silhouette of certain designs. But the real importance here behind organic lines is essentially where you're giving yourself some room as you go when you use your organic lines. As you pull those strokes to take the base shapes that you might want to create, the organic lines allows you to go over and over and over until your brain, your hand and your eyes find that synchronicity there, where what you're producing makes sense. It feels just right. It feels organic. So not only are the lines looking organic, but they are organically created because it's what naturally flows. So as you go over and over with the brush, because you have that transfer mode, that setting in the brush settings turned on, and as you apply your pen pressure, the harder that you press in certain areas of your base sketch gives it a little more definition. So it's drawn with a little more intention. It is still organic. However, the pen pressure, those strokes, those darker areas versus the lighter areas, that helps us to understand and helps your brain to understand not only what lines might it very soon be the real or actual lines you use, but helps you to also understand where certain parts of the face, from the top of the head, the mouth, the nose, the base, where those lines of division and those rough features of the face might be, those separating features. So where the jaw might be versus where the eyes have to be placed versus where the gills have to go, the fins, and then ultimately using your pen pressure and your strokes to outline, to gently and deliberately but organically outline just where you see these things on your design being placed. So typically what I like to do is start by using the base shape, which is the core shape of the body. And for Oof here, we can see I've used more or less a spherical sort of elliptical shape. All right, there's a slight squash to him, and that's because I think that spherical shape is a really easy core shape or base shape, a primitive shape to work with and put features on top of and come up with numerous amounts of designs, like an infinite amount of designs. All right, and once I have that core shape down, put in other simple shapes on top of that core shape to help my brain understand, okay, this is where the eyes go. This is where the mouth is supposed to be. This is where the head is. This is where the ears or the hair, depending on the character. And in his case, what I'm doing is I'm outlining and I'm telling my brain, I'm telling the sketch, I'm telling Photoshop that this core shape here, these are where I want to place my eyes. This is where I want to place the fin, and I'm doing it using some very simple shapes. I'm not going into a lot of detail necessarily to bring the detail out of the drawing. I'm using simple shapes to imply or to infer, to suggest the detail that either will be there or just allowing your brain to fill that gap, to fill the blanks. So as you begin to move along in the process of creating the lines or drafting those lines, it is quite fine, it is okay, it is normal to draw over those lines over and over until you feel like the way that the line is positioned, the darkness or the thickness of the stroke matches the intensity that you are aiming for in certain areas. Because listen to this. Depending on the intensity of the stroke, you are also telling your brain to some extent how to interpret the light and where exactly that light is coming from. So if the strokes on your character are heavier, typically speaking, on the top portion of the design, so from the head to the right side of the face, as we might see in Uf's case here, we know that the light is wherever the lines are thinner. That's where the light will be brightest or the most intense, typically speaking. So this is why you need to be careful with where you place the intensity of certain lines and just how many. There's no limit to the quantity of the lines, but why you are, putting lines in certain places needs to make sense. So I move along into adding more shapes, more simple shapes onto the design. Things like the spheres or the circles for the eyes, and even smaller curved triangles, similar to what I did for the fins on the top of the head. I'm doing it also for the mouth, for the teeth, the jaw teeth that might be protruding upwards. And that's what I mean by it's these simple, very simple shapes that they're being combined onto this natural, this organic form that we're seeing here, and your brain is already beginning to fill the gap with certain things. Your brain is able to interpret a lot of this data in ways that you are probably not realizing. So just going with what your mind is naturally telling you. Okay, your mind is telling you, I need to place this fin at this particular angle. The other side of the fish will need a fin also. Or if it's a story that you're telling where the fish, I don't know, got attacked, or he was born just similar to Finding Nemo, or Nemo and Finding Nemo has a damaged or lucky fin. It depends on the story that you're telling ultimately with the design. And this is where, in your case, when you're doing your design, even if you're not following this to a T, that the intentions behind your designs must be intentional. Even if it's weird, even if it feels out of place initially, do it with intention, and then you can always revisit these steps. So as you would see in this process, we'll also be using further layers on top of this organic sketch layer and switching the mode to multiply, which would allow us to further define or use these organic lines as a core, as like the base clay, and then come and add details on top of that and overlay it, allowing you a lot more control overall. So I think we've found like we have enough organic lines in place in forming our design, giving us a sense of where the features are supposed to be, a sense of direction, even movement, because we can use this layer to also establish, using some of those organic lines to establish a sense of movement, animation. All right, and you being able to capture that sense of movement in a static image, it takes skill and time, but it also does not have to be overthought. It doesn't have to be overshot. It can keep it simple. And if you use base shapes, to create your characters, you can just use those very base shapes and move those base shapes around in a space to understand how the character and all of the features, all of the accessories, all of the additional components or assets attached to this character's design will move with it. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, in this particular instance, oof is a sphere, all right? And it means that if I wanted to understand how a sphere would move in water or through the air or moving on the ground or just in how it rotates or how it rolls, I would use a ball. I can use a ball or something spherical to understand the geometry and understand how light would affect something that's shaped like that, which means that if it's a sphere and I see that it's perfectly uniformed all the way around, it means that the light needs to fall in such a way that it looks like it's, you know, wrapping perfectly around a spherical object. If you're using a cube or a cuboid or a pyramid, a cone, a cylinder, using these core shapes to develop your characters also helps you to simplify the designs when it comes to moving the characters, posing the characters, positioning the characters, or even rotating the characters for a character's design sheet. Spending some time on this particular layer, the organic layer, it's not meant to be rushed. Spending some time on the layer and really getting in touch with the features of the character before you move forward into more complex technical processes like filling color and lights and shadows and texture and wanting to add light and rim light. Just spending some time with what the core elements of the design needs to have allows you to at the same time subconsciously process what would be needed when the time comes. I fully can appreciate the fear of feeling that when you're working on a sketch, you're going to be stumped when it comes to the coloring of the design. However, I beg to differ that if you use this particular process and you actually work with these particular things in mind, that when it comes to coloring the character, these particular things will be informed, these particular parts of the process would have been informed subconsciously, and choosing these things, these colors and the brushes and the textures would just come organically. It comes naturally, it comes organically. And this is where trusting the process definitely comes in. So up next we add that we add a second layer that we will be using to further define the design, and we want to set that to multiply. Now what we want to do is drop the opacity on the previous layer, and on this layer we're going to set it to multiply, open the color picker, open the color swatch, and choose a slightly darker color so that, you know, we don't want to go too dark, but we do want to use a color that allows us to see over the previous layer, as well as begin creating the defining boundaries, the line art, the actual line art that will be used to guide the coloring process. A cool thing to note is that in the brush settings at the top of the panel, I can change the blending mode of not only the layers but of the brushes. If you change the blending mode from normal to multiply, you would notice that when you apply pressure to your pen, you would get an even darker flow of the paint than you would if you had it set to normal, or for the layer to be set to normal. So using this particular feature, I like to use it because it allows me to get darker lines faster on one particular layer, as well as allowing me to define certain areas, certain shapes, certain features without having to use too many additional layers or components to achieve that. Using slightly darker colors, lighter areas allows you to play with light as you sketch, way before you paint anything, way before there's any digital paint for light, way before there's any post-processing. Using your line art allows you to achieve that in the very early stages. All in all, I like to spend some time and just get up close and personal with the design. Like I said, understand what are the features that I'll be working with. So the inner parts of the eyelids on Oof, his eyeballs, I'm already thinking, okay, what are some of the colors that I might be interested in using? Color ultimately is affected more or less by light. Okay, without light, I don't think that we would be able to see color, at least not for what in the way that we see it right now, or for what it is. So without light hitting the cones in our eyes and all of that science magic happening inside of the retina and our brain processing that information, we are able to perceive the world. We're able to perceive the environment. And the environment is probably the most important thing to consider, even when you are sketching digitally, 2D, definitely when you're working in 3D, and even when you're working in real life. If you're painting from real life, if you're working in film, if you're that part of production where you're working with tangible elements in the real world, it's all light. Okay, because when you paint digitally and you paint shadows and then you paint your highlights and then it's all light, it's light play. That's all it is. That range, the color values, the color values in that family, the family of values in any given color, it's just the range of light on that particular spectrum. So if we could appreciate that light is the basis for everything, then I think that by paying a lot more attention to the environment that our characters would exist in, or that they would be housed in, that the design would rest in, I think that would inform a lot about what not only the colors but the overall design. Because where the character is part of the story. It is the story. Alright, the character is not necessarily a standalone unit, but if we can let the environment inform the story, inform the design, and inform all of the other steps in designing the character, such as coloring, lighting, and all of these components, then I think that that's a solid way to approach any design. Let your environment ultimately be the anchor piece of information that holds all of it together. It's the binding force to the driver. It's the binding force of the story. It's the driving force of the story in your particular character concept illustration. Now, in Oof's case, he is definitely going to be, as we know from the thumbnail, be set in an ocean setting. So the environment is that he's somewhere out in the ocean, some water source. Alright, so we know that the colors that we are going to be used is more like Caribbean colors, the blues, the greens, the turquoise, the yellows, the sunset colors, and that's the type of environment that will inform our colors. And we know that because he will be in water, we can expect to see certain other supporting elements, not only on the character but around the character. So just to remind you to hit Ctrl S at this point to save your project. It is a good habit to go to your preferences and turn on the autosave feature, so that while you work, Photoshop can save every couple minutes in certain segments. Or if you don't want to do that, you can give yourself a nice, game of memory to just keep it up, and every 5 minutes, Ctrl S, save. And once you save your document to somewhere on your machine, it is always a good habit to go back and check to make sure that the file is in fact there and it's working, because corrupted files do happen and bad saves are a thing. If, however, you have the full Adobe CC Suite package and you have access to the cloud, you have cloud storage, then you can definitely upload your files to your Adobe CC profile and access those files on any device where you can probably access Photoshop or Premiere, After Effects, whatever you might need. In this case, in this instance, it's Photoshop. And if you have a device that can read those files, definitely use the Adobe Cloud to access it easily. You can share it with others from there, and so on and so forth. So as I begin to define my character, understanding that okay, he is in the middle of the ocean, he's swimming, he's surrounded by water, I know that definitely fins are a thing, gills have to be a thing, and I begin to stylize this design by using rough lines. It's not careful, I'm not trying to treat it too delicately. The idea is just to kind of let my brain tell my hand what to do as fast as my eyes can see. Okay, just let your hand flow. That's something that I emphasize all the thing, letting the hand flow. So what is flow? Flow is essentially that creative process, that synchronicity, a synchronization between your eyes, your hands, and brain, where as you're going, your brain understands, I know I want to draw a fish swimming in water with fins and a gill and some tentacles and his facial expression. Like you have a mental image more or less of what you are creating. And the flow essentially is where you allow your mind to use the organic lines to basically set up the blueprint for you. It's not going to look fanciful. It's just like you understand where things have to go. It's rough lines, very rough. So you place where the jaw is supposed to go, where the eyeballs are supposed to go. Some of the details in the fins, even the way that the light might pass through and show you some of the divisions in the fins on the top of the head, on the edges as they're frayed, and the tentacles or the tendrils are attached to him. The two of them are at the jaw, at the base of the jaw. All of these things, they're being filled out and informed using these lines. And we're also getting a sense of shadowing as I go along, because I'm using some cross hatching, as we can see, to fill certain areas before I come in with actual colors. But that is to help me and definitely understand, that is to help me understand what is going on with my lighting before I actually begin to paint. I like to switch the layers on and off to make sure that, just to see what has been done previously and from where I am at right now. So if we look at the other layers turned on underneath the one that we are working with currently, we can see how the organic lines also gives it a nice cool concept arty grittiness. But that is actually the process, that's the working, almost that's our working column for how we would have arrived to where we are at currently with the details in the design that we see. So spending some time on this particular layer, on these layers generally speaking, would set your design up well for having the rendering of the coloring done way easier, because you would have your areas defined, you would have lines of definition, just the form overall informing what the actual character is, what the audience is looking at. And yeah, as we progress, I use my most recent layer to add some darker lines, define certain details, because I anticipate that in the next step that will be coming very soon, where I prime my colors, I'm going to be depending on those solid lines to really tell me where to start and where to stop, where I can bleed over the edges a little bit, and where it needs to be contained. Because in the areas where the lines are a lot looser, the lines are not as hard, the strokes are not as intense, you'd realize that in those areas the details or the colors might have some flex. However, in areas where the lines are very hard, you know that there's a definite boundary to a given flat color, a texture, or an overlap of the two. Okay, so you just have to you should ideally pay attention to the solid lines that you're putting, and not just make everything the same. Don't make all of the lines the same weight. What do I mean by the same weight? Don't let your strokes all be the same intensity in terms of darkness or size. You should really try to let the smaller parts, smaller details on the face, on the body, on the hands, depending on the type of pose that you're doing, the type of character, whether it be a bipedal character, whether it be a fish like this, an arachnid, a quadruped. You really have to look at using scale, simple objects, but also using line size and line weight. So you're seeing how we're beginning to layer the various components here. There are a couple things that are quite important when you're doing this to keep in mind. Yes, the goal is to ultimately arrive at the end in terms of having character, but we ultimately firstly need to get our base shapes or primitive shapes or primary shapes down. Use organic lines to help us get a feel of the three-dimensional form of the character, of the concept, whether it be a character, even a prop, the principles still ultimately apply. In the case where you're dealing with a character, you are looking for the details to give the character some character. You're going to get the concepts and physical traits, and you're using smaller and smaller versions, or you're compounding big shapes and smaller shapes into bigger shapes, and even smaller shapes into those big shapes and the bigger shapes, to arrive at a lot of detail. But this takes time, and in using layers to literally layer your detail, you will be able to take your time, spend time focusing on various areas. So you firstly focus on the lines for your skin, then you focus on the line for your facial features, and then we have the lines for the scales, or the different areas that we're seeing there, where I use some ovals to represent some texture. So with the amalgamation of all of these shapes, the overall design started to take form. It's beginning to come in, and they're beginning to see how they're working together to communicate between one another, and give us the final design. So I think that some very important things to keep in the back of your mind when you're sketching is that you have to be open to changing the design on the fly, and the lines are not permanent, they're not set in stone. If you make the mistake of trying to draw and to capture the lines right away in the first stroke, well, if that's what you're going for and that's your thing, then by all means you do it that way. If, however, you are trying to figure out a process in terms of capturing all the detail that you want comfortably and working with it within a space, a malleable space, using the organic lines, never try to capture it in one solid go. Just try to, like I say, just let the flow happen. So always be open to change in your work, be open to mistakes, be open to updating your work. Don't put the kind of constraints that you might want to put on yourself when you're fleshing out designs at such a rudimentary level. This is far from finished. So you should not spend too much time stressing over the fact that, the eye where you thought it was supposed to go has to move. That's negligible. At this point, if you know that the eye has to move, it means that you're doing the right thing. You are fleshing out the design, and it's revealing that there are components to the design that isn't working together too well. So I like to, if you see me zooming in and out sometimes, it's because I like to take a step back from the design as I'm working. It helps me to kind of make sure that even from a distance, I can make out this, whatever the creature is, and I can tell that to some extent that it is a recognizable feature, or creature in this case, and it's a fish. It's something that I could recognize as a face or as some kind of appendage. And if I notice that I can spot that from afar, then I could spend a lot more time up close just kind of detailing it. It's not to become obsessive over putting in the details, but the details should ultimately drive the story behind the character design. It should lend to something that is not only impacted by the environment, as I mentioned earlier, but the overall story. The design should be driven by the story. Like what parts of this character's story that led them to have the scars on their face, or this particular type of skin. What tribe did they come from? What breed of fish in this particular case? What part of the ocean does he live? And when you really put some thought into your character design, almost as if you're planning, you're creating a person, you're creating a character essentially, because that's what it is. You'd realize that as you begin to attach personality and traits, features, qualities about a character, and you create a short biography of that character, profile, that begins to inform just what you sketch and where you spend your time in developing your organic sketch layers, in developing the early stages of your conceptual design. Always try to keep in the back of your mind, as I mentioned, that with the stroke size, with the pen pressure, yes, how hard you might press on the stylus and the tablet might change the stroke size because of the settings we have enabled. You have to also pay attention to the the pixel size of the brush, the size of the actual brush that you're painting with. Currently, it's set to 3 pixels. You can work with 3 pixels or smaller because the size of the canvas that we're working on, 3 is okay. If you're working in a much higher resolution, you're going to need a larger brush size to compensate for the increase in the pixel range, and as a result it's going to get slightly more difficult to see a smaller brush size on a much larger canvas. A smaller canvas, however, a small brush size will still read or render as a normal to large rendering on a smaller canvas. So in this particular setting that we're using here, using 3 to 4 or from 4 and below is fine. Adjusting your line size to help you detail or fill color in certain areas is very important. You can adjust the size of your brush by simply going to the top of the toolbar next to the brush setting, clicking it and adjusting it on the slider, or simply highlighting the number and inserting a number in pixels that you would like the brush to jump up to. The numbers can go pretty high, I think almost in the hundreds, but you should really stick, like I said, ideally once we're sketching, only between 4 and below, and you should only go up to about 8 or 6 pixels when you're working with like larger details or filling in some temporary shadows using the value coloring and the values that you're using. In this case is that salmon color. So just to reiterate, we're looking at brush size, brush settings, and we're also looking at how we use those settings when we're interacting with the canvas through our stylus or graphic tablet. If you are by chance using a mouse, I cannot guarantee what the results in using those settings with the mouse might look like. If you're using the pen tool and you are successful, or you know your way around Photoshop using the mouse only, then kudos to you. But for everyone else out there, we are going to do it this way. So as we prepare this first part of the process, and we prepare it for priming, where we get it ready to do initial coloring stage, I just want you to know that when you are spending time sketching, it is really and truly where the majority of your time should be spent. The coloring is nice, but like any story, you need to have a written story before you can put on a performance. You need to have a written story before you can produce a movie. And I like to think of the lines, your sketch lines, as the writing aspect to this entire process. So it is better to spend your time writing, or in this case sketching, or filling in those lines, filling in those details, or using those organic lines, and let the story pour into the design, so that when it comes to coloring, you don't have to necessarily take it overboard with the colors. You can go very minimal, very simple design. I mean, it's always nice to go hyper polished and get very realistic, but once you have really decent line arts and you understand how to then play with the light and the shadow, lights and darks on that stage, and translate that knowledge into your colors, you're going to end up with a fantastic result. So as I prep it here, I'm using the smudge brush tool to just smudge the line art, because I combined several of those layers into one that allowed me to more or less smudge some of the areas to give it a faux shadow effect. So it's just like a fake shadow. It's more or less indicating to me where I should put shadows when I am ready to put shadows onto the character design. So as we prepare for phase 2, where we lay on our priming flats and then our flat colors, I just want you to, at this point, you should probably take a break, step away from the computer. Your eyes have been looking at the screen and following along for a pretty long time. And for your own health, the health of your eyes, your mental health, and just for your progress overall, I think you should let this video end and pick up in the second video. So thank you for watching up to this point. It has been a blast. I hope to see some of your line art. If you followed up to this point, you can post it somewhere down below. Give me a link, shout me in my inbox, or email us, it works, just to see what you've done using this technique, using your layers, using the multiply mode, using the different blending modes of your brush, using different sizes of your brush, And you don't have to get fancy with your brushes. You can use a standard brush with a nice transfer mode on, and using a brush dynamics on, and yeah, let's see what you guys make. So I'll catch you in part 2. Thanks guys.